China completes an artificial moon. More power battles at the highest level of the Chinese Communist Party. And sinister developments at the Olympics. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. China has built an artificial moon. And this is not a joke. It was inspired by a 20-year-old experiment that used magnets to levitate a frog. Maybe Chinese leader Xi Jinping is looking for ways to deal with a certain pesky toad. Send him to the moon. But China's artificial moon might not quite be what you're imagining. These are the schematics. It's a vacuum chamber housing a 2-foot-wide artificial moon made up of rocks and dust. The magnets essentially recreate the gravity on the moon, a sixth of what it is on Earth. When the field is strong enough, it can magnetize and levitate things, from a living frog to a chestnut, against the gravitational force. Why are scientists so into levitating frogs? Anyway, this artificial moon is the first of its kind, according to the lead scientist from the China University of Mining and Technology. The artificial moon will allow Chinese scientists to simulate a testing environment very similar to the moon, where rocks and dust can behave in a completely different way than they do on Earth. There is no atmosphere on the moon, the temperature can change quickly and dramatically, and in low gravity, soil particles are more loosely bound to each other. And the Chinese Communist Party has some very ambitious moon plans. They want to land astronauts on the moon by 2030. And there's some talk of a China-Russia moon base. In other words, Space Race 2 is going to be very interesting. Speaking of the new Cold War, Britain's MI5 has warned that a Chinese agent has infiltrated Parliament. An alert from the security service said Christine Li established links for the Chinese Communist Party with current and aspiring MPs. Christine Li is a London-based solicitor. According to MI5, she knowingly engaged in political interference activities on behalf of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. Li also gave donations to politicians, with funding from foreign nationals in China and Hong Kong. According to the BBC, this is the result of a long-running investigation. Now, it's important to note that Li has so far not been accused of doing anything illegal. There aren't really laws in the UK against the type of foreign interference Li seems to have been involved in, which is one reason it's so easy for the Chinese Communist Party to interfere in the UK and other liberal democracies. And after the break, Chinese leader Xi Jinping gives his first marching orders to the Chinese military this year. Welcome back. It's a brand new year, but for Chinese leader Xi Jinping, it's not a time for resolutions. It's time for issuing his first orders of the year to the military. As the head of the People's Liberation Army, which is the Communist Party's military, Xi told troops to keep an eye on the changes in national security and military struggle, and the changes in technology, warfare, and opponents. Xi did not specify who those opponents are. I'll let you speculate. However, at the end of the year, there's going to be a major meeting of the Communist Party. And if you've been watching everyone's favorite communist soap opera, General Hostility, you know that means internal power struggles within the Communist Party. In previous years, Xi had been focused on military threats from foreign countries and warfare preparation. This year, it was a lot more vague, almost as if some of those threats might not be from foreign countries, maybe from Xi's internal political enemies. The day after Xi gave the military its orders, Xi's close ally, Wang Xiaohong, secretary of the party committee of the Ministry of Public Security, published this article in party mouthpiece, The People's Daily. It says public security departments should be guided by Xi Jinping thought and crush all kinds of attempts to endanger political security. Yeah, sounds like the factional infighting in the Communist Party is going to be pretty intense this year. I can't wait for the next episode of General Hostility. Speaking of elite power competitions, the Winter Olympics are just 3 weeks away, and China is making a show of opening up the internet for it. China has the most repressive internet control in the world, but the Chinese regime has promised Olympic athletes free access to social media platforms and other websites in the Olympic Village in Beijing. Again, just the foreign athletes and just while they're in the Olympic Village. But even still, experts expect heavy surveillance of online activity to continue, even for visitors who are allowed to access sites that would otherwise be blocked. You know, for any foreign athlete who might be thinking of taking some kind of stand for human rights. The Chinese internet police would get word of that. And then, the biathlon contestants might have something more interesting to shoot at. Speaking of Olympic surveillance, espionage is also a concern for athletes. Dutch athletes have been warned not to bring their phones or laptops to China for just that reason. Dutch team members will be equipped with unused devices in China to protect their personal data from Chinese surveillance. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party is taking the news really well. My favorite state-run media, the Global Times, criticized the Netherlands by bringing up the NSA, accusing America of getting a Tibetan activist to influence the Dutch Olympic Committee, and dissing the Netherlands' COVID response. Look, it makes sense if you work for the Global Times. And coming up after the break, China's zero COVID policy is in more trouble. Welcome back. COVID is a particular concern of the Chinese regime during the Olympics. China has begun handing out jail terms as long as 4 years for people violating draconian lockdown measures. The sad thing is, millions of Chinese citizens have become complicit in enforcing China's insane zero-COVID policy. In Xi'an, hospital employees refused to admit a man suffering from chest pains because he lived in a medium-risk district. He died of a heart attack. In another case, hospital workers refused to admit a woman who was 8 months pregnant and bleeding because her COVID test wasn't valid. She lost her baby. 2 community security guards told a young man they didn't care that he had nothing to eat after catching him out during the lockdown. They beat him up. It's amazing what people will do simply because someone in power told them to do it, or paid them to do it. However, China is ordering civil servants across the country to tighten their belts. Local governments across the country are cutting back on a range of perks and bonuses as part of a drive to reduce costs. So maybe they'll stop enforcing draconian policies if there's no money in it. Earlier this week, we did an episode on how China's zero COVID policy is falling apart. Check it out if YouTube somehow forgot to let you know about it. In that episode, I mentioned that China's zero COVID policy is unsustainable. So they're starting to do things like call it societal zero COVID instead, which means there's still COVID. And as Bloomberg points out, the Communist Party is playing more word games too. According to the government, COVID zero is no longer China's policy goal. Rather, it's aiming for dynamic clearing, which relies on local governments to stamp out local outbreaks. And if you're thinking that dynamic clearing sounds exactly like COVID zero, but with an easier way to blame local governments for failing, you'd be right. I bet local officials are loving this, especially as outbreaks continue to spread across China. Yet another wonderful sign for Hong Kong. The former security chief of Xinjiang, you know, where there's all the mass surveillance and genocide, yeah, he's been put in charge of the Chinese army garrison in Hong Kong. That'll go well. In some good news for a change, Taiwan continues to ramp up its support for Lithuania. Lithuania has been facing economic attacks from the Chinese Communist Party because the government supported Taiwan. Taiwan this week announced a $1 billion Lithuania credit fund to enhance economic cooperation between the two countries. Meanwhile, Lithuania's foreign minister has called on the EU to stand up to China. Taiwan and Lithuania, not the heroes we deserved, but the heroes we need. China continues to encroach on the border with Bhutan, with new construction across 6 new sites. Satellite images show a massive buildup, over 200 new structures. This area has a lot of strategic value for the Chinese military. It's at the junction of the borders of India, Bhutan, and China, where Indian and Chinese troops were locked in standoff for more than 2 months in 2017. So expect to hear China having more border conflicts with India in 2022. And now is the time when I answer questions from you, my loyal 50-cent army, fans of the show who support what we do through the crowdfunding website Patreon or the exclusive social media platform Locals. LOL No asks on Patreon, do you think companies are going to move outside of China and start more factories in the EU instead? It would be interesting to see what would happen if factories would stop selling to China and start only selling in EU, US, and countries with no connection to China. That's a very good question. Actually, during the Trump administration, we noticed a lot of companies were beginning to move their supply chains out of China. However, they weren't exactly bringing manufacturing back to America, or even the EU. Most set up shop in other Asian countries. I've started to see a lot more things made in Vietnam. Recently, the U.S. passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That should also encourage more Western companies to get their supply chains out of China, or else risk violating U.S. law. Not to mention, if China keeps locking down because of COVID cases, more companies are going to need to switch their supply chains or risk never getting their products out of China. Ultimately, this might mean consumers will have more opportunities to buy things not made in China, which would be great. We're actually working on a new YouTube channel that helps people find products that are not made in China. Is that something you're interested in? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for your question and your support. LOL No. And for all of you watching, consider joining the China Uncensored 50-cent army. You'll have a chance to ask me questions on the show, and there are some other cool perks as well. Check out patreon.com/ChinaUncensored or ChinaUncensored.locals.com to learn more. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.